October 17th, 1986, 3:42 a.m., Naval Ocean Surveillance Information Center, Suitland, Maryland. The coffee had gone cold hours ago. Senior acoustic analyst Robert Hartley sat frozen in front of his console, headphones pressed tight against his ears. His hand trembled as he reached for the dial, rewinding the recording for the 7th time. The other analysts in the darkened room continued their work, unaware that everything they believed about American technological superiority was about to shatter. There it was again. That sound. That impossible, terrifying sound. Hartley ripped off his headphones and turned to the officer on duty. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Sir, you need to hear this, right now." The recording was from a SOSUS array in the North Atlantic, one of the most sophisticated underwater listening systems ever built. For decades, it had been America's secret weapon, capable of detecting Soviet submarines thousands of miles away. The Soviets were loud. Their submarines rumbled through the ocean like freight trains, their propellers churning the water with a distinctive cavitation signature that American analysts could identify in their sleep. But this recording, this was different. "That's impossible," the duty officer whispered after listening. "That has to be one of ours. That's the acoustic profile of a Los Angeles-class submarine." Hartley shook his head slowly. "Sir, that's what I thought too. I checked. Every single one of our boats is accounted for. That submarine..." He paused, struggling to find the words. "That submarine is Soviet." In that moment, in that cramped, windowless room in suburban Maryland, the foundations of American naval dominance began to crack. What they were hearing shouldn't exist. The Soviets had somehow, impossibly, built a submarine that sounded exactly like the pride of the American fleet. But what these men didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have known, was that this moment was the culmination of the most devastating intelligence failure in American history. A failure that had been unfolding for nearly 2 decades, hidden in plain sight, perpetrated by people they trusted with their lives. This is the story of how America lost its greatest military secret. And it begins not with a spy, but with a desperate man and a simple, terrible decision. If you find this story fascinating, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. These stories take weeks to research and produce, and your support helps us bring more of these untold chapters of history to light. Now, let's go back to where it all began. November 1967, Norfolk, Virginia. The rain came down in sheets, hammering the windshield of a battered Ford Galaxy parked outside a rundown bar near the naval base. Inside the car, a man sat alone in the darkness, staring at the neon sign flickering through the rain-streaked glass. John Anthony Walker Jr. was 30 years old, a chief warrant officer in the United States Navy, and he was drowning. Not in water, in debt, in shame, in the crushing weight of a life that had somehow gone completely wrong. His marriage was falling apart. His wife Barbara had discovered his affairs, his drinking, his lies. The bills were piling up faster than he could pay them. He had children to feed, a house he couldn't afford, and a gambling habit that consumed whatever money was left. His Navy salary, once a source of pride, now felt like a cruel joke. Walker lit another cigarette and watched the smoke curl up toward the car's stained ceiling. He had tried everything. Borrowed money from friends, taken out loans he couldn't repay, even considered robbery, though he'd quickly dismissed that as too risky. But there was another option, an option so dangerous, so unthinkable, that it had been lurking in the back of his mind for months, growing stronger with each unpaid bill, each screaming argument with Barbara, each reminder of how far he had fallen. John Walker worked in the communications center at Naval Submarine Base Norfolk. Every day, he handled some of the most classified material in the entire United States military, the cryptographic keys that protected all Navy communications. These key lists, changed monthly, were the crown jewels of American military security. With them, an enemy could read every message sent by every ship, every submarine, every naval installation around the world. Walker knew exactly what those keys were worth. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that would compromise American security for 18 years, cost untold billions of dollars, and fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Cold War. But on that rainy November night, John Walker was thinking only of survival. He made a decision, and that decision would change everything. The Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. occupied an imposing building on 16th Street, just 16 blocks from the White House. To most Americans who passed it, it was simply another diplomatic facility, its windows dark and unwelcoming. But behind those walls was one of the most active intelligence operations in the Western Hemisphere, the Washington Residentura of the KGB. On a cold December evening in 1967, a taxi pulled up to the curb near the embassy. A man in a Navy uniform stepped out, paid the driver in cash, and walked briskly toward the entrance. His heart was pounding so hard he was certain the Marine guards at the nearby building could hear it. John Walker pushed through the door and approached the reception desk. His mouth was dry, his hands shaking. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his mind, but now that he was here, the words seemed to evaporate. "I have information," he finally managed. "Important information. I want to speak to someone in security." The receptionist's expression didn't change. She picked up a phone, spoke quietly in Russian, and a moment later a young man in a dark suit appeared. His English was perfect, his manner calm and professional. "Please, come with me." Walker followed him down a hallway, through a heavy door, and into a small, windowless room. 2 chairs, a table, nothing else. The young man gestured for Walker to sit. "You said you have information. What kind of information?" Walker reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document, a single page from that month's cryptographic key list. He slid it across the table. The Russian's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He studied the document for a long moment, then looked up at Walker with new interest. "Wait here." The young man left, taking the document with him. Walker sat alone in the silence, listening to his own breathing, wondering if he had just made the worst mistake of his life. 20 minutes later, the door opened again, but this time it wasn't the young diplomat. This man was older, harder, with the eyes of someone who had seen things that would haunt lesser men. He introduced himself only as Yuri. In reality, this was Yuri Linkov, one of the KGB's most experienced handlers, a man who specialized in recruiting and running American agents. He had seen his share of walk-ins, people who showed up uninvited, offering to betray their country. Most were fantasists, frauds, or FBI plants. But occasionally, very occasionally, someone real came through the door. Yuri sat down across from Walker and studied him with unsettling intensity. "Tell me about yourself. Who are you? What do you do?" Walker talked. He talked about his position at the communications center. He talked about the cryptographic materials he handled daily. He talked about his debts, his failing marriage, his desperate need for money. He held nothing back. When he finished, Yuri nodded slowly. "The document you brought us, we have verified it is genuine. This is significant material." "There's more where that came from," Walker said quickly. "I can get you everything, every month. All the key lists, the operating procedures, everything." Yuri was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope thick with cash. He slid it across the table. "This is for what you have already provided. Consider it a gesture of good faith." He paused. "We will want to meet again. There are protocols to establish, security measures to discuss. Are you prepared to continue this relationship?" Walker looked at the envelope. Later he would count it. $4,000 in crisp, unmarked bills. More money than he made in months at his Navy job. Enough to pay off his most pressing debts. Enough to breathe again. He took the envelope. "Yes," he said, "I'm prepared." In that moment, John Walker became an agent of the Soviet Union, codename K4. But the KGB had no idea, could not possibly have imagined, just how valuable this desperate, debt-ridden sailor would become. The scope of what John Walker was about to give them would exceed their wildest expectations, because Walker didn't just have access to cryptographic key lists, he had access to everything. What the Soviets received in the following months was nothing less than the complete blueprint of American naval communications. Walker provided them with the key lists that protected all classified Navy messages. He provided them with the technical manuals that explained how the cryptographic machines worked. He provided them with the maintenance schedules, the operating procedures, the wiring diagrams, everything needed to break American codes not just today, but for years to come. The KGB was stunned. In their decades of intelligence operations against the United States, they had never received material of such extraordinary value. They estimated that the intelligence Walker provided in his first year alone was worth more than $1 billion in research and development costs they would have otherwise spent trying to break American codes. But this created a problem that would ultimately contribute to one of the most significant technological transfers in Cold War history. You see, having the key lists wasn't enough. To actually read American communications, the Soviets needed to replicate the cryptographic machines themselves, the sophisticated devices that used these keys to encrypt and decrypt messages. And that required something Walker couldn't provide, the actual hardware. This is where our story takes a crucial turn. Because the Soviets weren't just trying to read American messages, they were trying to close a technological gap that had haunted them for decades, a gap that was nowhere more apparent than in the dark waters of the world's oceans. Let me take you beneath the surface. Let me show you why what happened next would bring a superpower to its knees. In the early 1980s, the United States Navy operated the most sophisticated fleet of nuclear submarines in the world. The crown jewel of this fleet was the Los Angeles-class attack submarine, a marvel of engineering that represented the absolute cutting edge of American technology. These boats were hunters. Their mission, track and destroy Soviet ballistic missile submarines, the underwater platforms that carried nuclear weapons capable of annihilating American cities. In the event of nuclear war, American attack submarines would be the first line of defense, racing to sink Soviet missile boats before they could launch their apocalyptic payloads. But to hunt, you must first find your prey, and in the dark, crushing depths of the ocean, finding anything is almost impossible. Sound, that was the key. In the underwater world, sound travels for hundreds of miles, bouncing off thermal layers, channeling through temperature gradients, carrying information about everything it touches. American scientists had spent decades learning to read these acoustic signatures, building hydrophone arrays on the ocean floor, training analysts to pick out the faintest whisper of a submarine's passage from the endless background noise of the sea. And American submarines were ghosts. The Los Angeles-class boats were engineered from the keel up for silence. Their reactors were mounted on elaborate shock-absorbing platforms. Their propellers were machined to tolerances measured in millionths of an inch, each blade carefully crafted to move through the water without creating the telltale bubbles of cavitation. Every pump, every valve, every piece of rotating machinery was designed, tested, and redesigned to eliminate noise. The result was a submarine so quiet that it could slip past Soviet sensors undetected, trailing Soviet missile boats without their crews ever knowing an American hunter was watching their every move. Soviet submarines, by contrast, were loud. The early nuclear boats were notoriously noisy, their crews joking that they could hear American submarines laughing at them from miles away. Later designs improved, but the Soviets could never quite close the gap. American acoustic analysts could track Soviet boats across entire oceans, following their distinctive sound signatures like fingerprints. This acoustic advantage was America's ace in the hole. It meant that in any conflict, American submarines would see the enemy first, strike first, survive. It was the cornerstone of American naval strategy, the foundation upon which billions of dollars and decades of planning had been built. And it was about to disappear. But here's what made the situation even more dangerous. Something that the analysts in that darkened room in Maryland didn't fully understand when they first heard that impossible recording. The acoustic technology wasn't just about hearing the enemy, it was about making sure the enemy couldn't hear you. American submarines carried nuclear missiles too, ballistic missile submarines, the famous boomers, hid in the deep ocean, their locations unknown, their missiles ready to launch at a moment's notice. This was the ultimate deterrent, the guarantee that even if the Soviet Union launched a first strike that destroyed every American city, these hidden submarines would survive to deliver devastating retaliation. But this only worked if the submarines stayed hidden. If the Soviets could find and track American missile submarines, they could potentially destroy them before they could launch. The entire doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the grim calculation that had prevented nuclear war for decades, depended on those submarines remaining invisible. Now, do you see why that recording in the Maryland Analysis Center was so terrifying? If the Soviets had truly built a submarine that quiet, it meant two things, both catastrophic. First, American attack submarines would no longer be able to find and track Soviet missile boats. The hunters would become blind. Second, and far worse, Soviet attack submarines could now potentially find and track American missile boats. The hunted would become the hunters. The balance of terror that had kept the world from nuclear annihilation was suddenly, terrifyingly, in jeopardy. But how? How had the Soviets made this impossible leap? That was the question that began to consume American intelligence agencies in the fall of 1986, and the answer, when it finally emerged, would implicate not just one traitor, but an entire network of spies, corrupt officials, and greedy corporations spanning 3 continents. Let's go back. Back to John Walker, still selling secrets, still getting paid. But his operation was about to expand in ways even the KGB hadn't anticipated. By 1976, John Walker had been working for the Soviets for nearly a decade. He had been promoted, transferred, given new assignments, and at every step, he had found ways to continue providing classified material to his handlers. The KGB considered him one of their most valuable assets, a golden source that kept producing year after year. But Walker was getting nervous. He was approaching retirement age. Soon, he would no longer have access to the material the Soviets wanted so desperately. His income stream, by now he was receiving tens of thousands of dollars per year, would dry up. So he came up with a solution. He would recruit others. The first was Jerry Whitworth, a friend and fellow Navy communications specialist. Whitworth was brilliant but bitter, convinced that the Navy had never given him the recognition he deserved. Walker approached him carefully, testing his loyalty, probing for weaknesses. When he finally revealed what he was doing, Whitworth barely hesitated. How much does it pay? The answer was, a lot. Whitworth became Walker's most productive subagent, providing an avalanche of classified material from every assignment the Navy gave him. When Whitworth served aboard the aircraft carrier Enterprise, he photographed thousands of pages of cryptographic documents. When he was assigned to a shore facility that processed military satellite communications, he provided the Soviets with the keys to some of America's most sophisticated intelligence gathering systems. But Walker didn't stop there. He recruited his own son, Michael, a young sailor just starting his Navy career, and he recruited his brother, Arthur, a retired Navy officer with a defense contractor. The Walker spy ring, as it would later be called, became a family business, a multi-generational enterprise dedicated to betraying their country. The intelligence they provided was staggering in scope. Years later, government investigators would estimate that Walker and his ring compromised more than 1 million classified messages. They gave the Soviets the ability to read virtually every encrypted communication the Navy sent for nearly 2 decades. But here's the crucial part, the part that connects directly to that impossible submarine recording in 1986. Among the secrets Walker provided were detailed technical specifications of American submarine technology. Not just communications, but propulsion systems, sound dampening techniques, the precise frequencies that American sensors used to detect enemy submarines. He gave them the blueprints of American silence. And the Soviets used them. But blueprints alone weren't enough. To actually build a quiet submarine, the Soviets needed manufacturing capabilities they didn't possess. Their factories couldn't machine the components to the tolerances required. Their metallurgists couldn't produce the specialized alloys. Their engineers couldn't replicate the precision that American technology demanded. They needed help, and they found it in an unlikely place: Japan. In 1980, a Soviet trade delegation arrived in Tokyo with a shopping list. At the top of that list, computer-controlled milling machines capable of machining metal to extraordinarily precise tolerances. These machines, manufactured by a company called Toshiba Machine Company, were among the most sophisticated in the world. There was just one problem. These machines were covered by COCOM, the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, a Cold War-era agreement that prohibited the sale of sensitive technology to communist countries. Selling them to the Soviet Union was illegal. But the Soviets were willing to pay, handsomely. What happened next remains one of the most controversial episodes in Cold War industrial history. Toshiba Machine Company, in partnership with a Norwegian company called Kongsberg Våpenfabrik that provided the necessary software, agreed to sell the Soviets the machines they wanted. The deal was conducted in secret, with falsified end-user certificates claiming the machines were destined for a civilian factory in Leningrad. Between 1982 and 1984, Toshiba delivered 4 massive 9-axis milling machines to the Soviet Union. These machines could carve propeller blades to tolerances measured in microns, a level of precision the Soviets had never before achieved. Now the pieces were in place. The Soviets had the technical specifications from Walker, they had the manufacturing capability from Toshiba, and they had something else: time. For years, American intelligence had no idea what was happening. The Walker ring continued operating undetected. The Toshiba sale remained hidden behind layers of falsified paperwork, and in secret shipyards along the Soviet coast, a new generation of submarines was taking shape. Submarines designed from the ground up to be silent. The Akula-class attack submarine, NATO reporting name for what the Soviets called Project 971 Shuka-B, began entering service in 1984. These boats incorporated everything the Soviets had learned from their espionage coup. They featured advanced anechoic coating, rubberized tiles that absorbed sonar pings. They had new reactor designs mounted on improved shock-absorbing platforms. And most crucially, they had propellers machined on Toshiba's equipment, with blades so precisely shaped that they slipped through the water with minimal turbulence. The result was a submarine that American sensors could barely detect. But the full magnitude of the disaster wouldn't become clear until 1985, when a series of events brought the entire house of cards crashing down. May 20th, 1985. The beginning of the end came, as it so often does, from within. John Walker's ex-wife, Barbara, had known about his espionage for years. She had kept silent, partly out of fear, partly because she benefited from the money. But the marriage had ended badly, and as the years passed, her resentment grew. She started drinking heavily. She started talking. In November 1984, Barbara Walker walked into the FBI field office in Hyannis, Massachusetts, and told them everything. The FBI didn't believe her at first. Her story seemed too incredible. A Navy communications officer selling secrets for 17 years? A family spy ring? It sounded like the plot of a bad movie. But they investigated anyway, and what they found sent shockwaves through the American intelligence community. John Walker was placed under surveillance. On May 19, 1985, FBI agents watched as he drove to a rural road in Maryland, pulled over and placed a paper bag at the base of a utility pole. It was a dead drop, a prearranged location where he'd left material for his Soviet handlers to retrieve. The next morning, Walker was arrested. Over the following weeks, Jerry Whitworth, Michael Walker, and Arthur Walker were also taken into custody. The Walker spy ring was finished. But the damage was done, and it was far worse than anyone initially realized. In debriefing sessions that lasted for months, John Walker revealed the full scope of his betrayal. He had provided the Soviets with cryptographic keys for virtually every major Navy communication system. He had given them technical manuals, operating procedures, wiring diagrams. He had compromised military operations across the globe, from the Vietnam War to NATO exercises in the North Atlantic. Vitaly Yurchenko, a high-ranking KGB officer who defected to the United States in August 1985, confirmed the devastating impact. The Walker spy ring, Yurchenko told his debriefers, was the most important Soviet espionage operation in history. It gave us everything we needed. But even as the Walker investigation unfolded, another shoe was about to drop. In early 1986, American intelligence received a tip from a Japanese source about the Toshiba sale. Investigators began digging, and what they found was almost as shocking as the Walker revelations. The Toshiba machines had been installed in the Leningrad shipyard responsible for building the newest generation of Soviet submarines. Production records showed that propeller manufacturing precision had improved dramatically after the machines arrived, and the timing lined up perfectly with the appearance of the impossibly quiet Akula-class boats. This brings us back to where we started. That moment in the Naval Ocean Surveillance Information Center, October 1986, when analyst Robert Hartley heard a Soviet submarine that sounded like an American boat. The sound he was hearing was the product of everything we've discussed: Walker's betrayal, Toshiba's illegal sale, years of Soviet engineering effort. It was the sound of American technological superiority evaporating. And now, finally, the implications were becoming clear to those at the highest levels of the U.S. government. The reaction in Washington was volcanic. When Secretary of the Navy John Lehman received the full briefing on the combined Walker-Toshiba intelligence compromise, he reportedly turned pale and asked everyone to leave the room. He needed a moment to process what he had just heard. The numbers were staggering. Conservative estimates suggested that countering the Soviet acoustic advances would cost American taxpayers at least $30 billion, and that was just for the technology to restore the previous acoustic gap. Some analysts put the real figure much higher, arguing that the damage was essentially incalculable. Think about what had been lost: decades of research and development in submarine silencing, years of carefully accumulated data on Soviet acoustic signatures, now useless because the signatures had changed. The entire network of underwater listening posts, built at enormous expense during the Cold War, suddenly far less effective. And something more, the confidence that American submarines would always have the upper hand. That certainty, which had shaped naval strategy since World War II, was gone. "We've been fighting deaf and blind for 10 years, one admiral reportedly said, and we didn't even know it. The political fallout was equally severe. When the Toshiba Kongsberg scandal became public in 1987, American politicians were furious. On the floor of Congress, members smashed Toshiba products with sledgehammers to protest the company's betrayal. Trade sanctions were imposed, criminal prosecutions were launched. But the anger masked a deeper anxiety. If this could happen, if American secrets could be sold so easily, if critical technology could be transferred with a few forged documents, what else might have been compromised? The answer, it turned out, was a great deal. In the years following the Walker arrest, American counterintelligence agencies conducted a massive damage assessment. What they found was a litany of espionage disasters stretching back decades. The Walker ring was just the most damaging of dozens of spy cases that had hemorrhaged secrets to the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. There was Aldrich Ames, the CIA officer who sold out virtually every American agent in the Soviet Union, leading to at least 10 executions. There was Robert Hansen, the FBI counterintelligence agent who spent more than 20 years working for the KGB, compromising some of the most sensitive operations in American intelligence. And there were countless others: the faceless procurement officials who approved illegal technology transfers, the corporate executives who looked the other way while their products shipped to Soviet addresses, the engineers and scientists who shared just a bit too much at international conferences. The picture that emerged was not of a few isolated traitors, but of a systemic failure. American counterintelligence had been comprehensively outmatched. The Soviets had penetrated deeply into American security, and no one had noticed until it was far too late. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because even as American intelligence was reeling from these revelations, events were unfolding that would make much of it irrelevant. November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. 2 years later, on December 26th, 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. The Cold War, which had shaped global politics for nearly half a century, was over. The enemy that American intelligence had spent so many resources trying to defeat had simply ceased to exist. This created a strange situation. All those secrets that Walker had sold, all that technology that Toshiba had transferred, all those billions of dollars in damage, did any of it actually matter anymore? The answer is complicated. On one hand, the immediate threat had passed. The Soviet submarine fleet, once the terror of American naval planners, was rusting in port, its sailors unpaid, its bases falling into disrepair. The great undersea conflict that everyone had prepared for never happened. On the other hand, the legacy of the Cold War espionage continued to ripple outward. Much of the submarine technology that the Soviets developed with Walker's help and Toshiba's machines was eventually transferred to other countries, most notably China, which acquired Akula-class technology in the 1990s and used it to accelerate its own submarine program. The techniques for running espionage operations that the KGB perfected during the Walker years didn't disappear either. Russian intelligence agencies, the successors to the KGB, continue to use many of the same methods today. And the vulnerabilities in American security that Walker exploited, the over-reliance on trust, the inadequate oversight, the assumption that cleared personnel would remain loyal, those vulnerabilities persist. But perhaps the most lasting impact was psychological. The Walker case shattered a certain American complacency about security. It proved that catastrophic espionage wasn't something that happened in other countries and other times. It could happen here. It could happen quietly, invisibly for years. John Walker died in federal prison on August 28, 2014. He was 77 years old and had served 25 years of a life sentence. He never expressed remorse for what he had done. In interviews, he insisted that he had done it for the money, nothing more. Ideology didn't enter into it. Kmart has better values, he once said, twisting the retailer's famous slogan into a dark joke about his own betrayal. Jerry Whitworth received a 365-year sentence, the longest ever given for espionage at the time. Michael Walker served 25 years. Arthur Walker served 14 years and died shortly after his release. The corporate figures fared better. Toshiba Machine Company paid a fine and accepted a 3-year ban on U.S. government contracts. A few low-level executives faced charges in Japan, but no one went to prison. The company survived, prospered, and eventually merged with other entities. Today, the Toshiba name is still found on products around the world. Kongsberg Våpenfabrik, the Norwegian company that provided the software for the milling machines, was also penalized but not destroyed. It continues to operate today as Kongsberg Gruppen, one of Norway's largest defense contractors. Justice, it seems, is selective. But what about those quiet Soviet submarines, the Akulas that had so terrified American analysts in that darkened Maryland room? What became of them? Most are gone now. The Russian Navy, inheritor of the Soviet fleet, lacks the resources to maintain such sophisticated vessels. Many Akulas were decommissioned in the 1990s and 2000s. A few remain in service, aging relics of a superpower that no longer exists. But their descendants swim in other waters. Chinese submarines, built using technology derived from the Akula program, now patrol the South China Sea. These boats are quieter than anything the Chinese Navy has operated before, quiet enough to concern American naval planners, quiet enough to shift the balance of power in the Pacific. The echoes of Walker's betrayal continue to ripple outward, 30 years after his arrest. Let me take you back one final time. Back to that moment in October 1986, when analyst Robert Hartley sat in the darkness, listening to a sound that shouldn't exist. What was going through his mind in those first seconds of recognition? We can only imagine. But consider what he was hearing. The end of certainty, the collapse of assumptions that had shaped his entire career, the realization that everything he had believed about American superiority was wrong. "That sound," he reportedly said later, "that's our submarine. I knew it in my gut, but it wasn't ours. It was theirs. And in that moment, I knew we were in trouble." Trouble, indeed. Trouble that had been building for 18 years, hidden by a combination of greed, incompetence, and sheer luck. Trouble that would cost billions of dollars to address. Trouble that, in some ways, was never fully addressed at all. This is what espionage really looks like. Not the glamorous world of James Bond with its gadgets and car chases and beautiful spies, but a middle-aged man with gambling debts and a failing marriage, sitting in his car outside a bar, calculating what his country's secrets might be worth. A company executive signing shipping documents for machines he knows will end up in enemy hands. A network of small betrayals, each one seemingly insignificant, accumulating over years until suddenly the foundations crumble. In the end, the Walker case is a story about trust, and what happens when that trust is betrayed. The U.S. Navy trusted John Walker with its most sensitive secrets. The international community trusted Toshiba to follow export regulations. The American people trusted their government to protect them from foreign threats. All of that trust was violated, and the consequences lasted far longer than anyone imagined. Today, as new great power competitions take shape, as technology becomes ever more central to national security, the lessons of the Walker case remain painfully relevant. Secrets can be stolen, advantages can be erased, decades of work can be undone by a single person with access and motive. The sound of that Soviet submarine, the impossible sound of American technology in enemy hands, still echoes in the halls of the Pentagon. It serves as a reminder, in the shadow world of intelligence and espionage, nothing is ever truly secure, and the price of complacency can be catastrophic. As we conclude this story, consider what we've learned. Consider the chain of decisions, each one seemingly small, that led to such devastating consequences. Consider the men who chose money over loyalty, profit over principle. Consider the institutions that failed to detect the betrayal until it was far too late. And consider this. Somewhere, right now, another John Walker may be making the same calculation. Another company may be signing export documents they shouldn't sign. Another secret may be flowing to adversaries who will use it to narrow the gaps we thought were insurmountable. The Cold War is over, but the Shadow War continues, and the next revelation, the next "that's our submarine" moment, could be far more devastating than anything we've seen before. That is the enduring legacy of John Walker, Jerry Whitworth, and the quiet conspiracy that nearly brought a superpower to its knees. Not the secrets they sold, but the lesson they taught. In the world of intelligence, trust is the most valuable commodity of all. And it is always, always fragile. Some historians argue that the Walker spy ring actually prolonged the Cold War by giving the Soviets confidence in their ability to compete with American technology. By eliminating the element of surprise, Walker may have made Soviet leaders more willing to continue the arms race, postponing the inevitable collapse of their system. Others take a different view. They suggest that the intelligence Walker provided actually stabilized the Cold War by reducing uncertainty on the Soviet side. A Soviet leadership that understood American capabilities, the argument goes, was less likely to miscalculate, less likely to make the catastrophic error that could have led to nuclear war. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Espionage is a double-edged sword. It can provide valuable information to adversaries, but it can also create channels of communication, ways of understanding the other side that might not otherwise exist. What we can say with certainty is that the world changed because of what John Walker did. The balance of power shifted. Technologies were developed that might not otherwise have existed. Billions of dollars flowed into programs designed to counter threats that would never have emerged without Walker's betrayal. And countless lives were affected. The sailors who served on submarines that were suddenly more vulnerable, the intelligence officers who had to rebuild systems that Walker had compromised, the families of those who worked to undo the damage. This is the true cost of espionage, not just the secrets lost, but the ripples that spread outward, affecting people and institutions far removed from the original betrayal. Every spy case is a stone thrown into a pond, its waves reaching shores that no one can predict. The naval historian Norman Palmer, who has studied the Walker case extensively, put it this way: the Walker spy ring may have been the most damaging Soviet espionage operation in American history. It compromised not just communications, but the fundamental assumptions upon which American naval strategy was built. We thought we were fighting one war. In reality, the Soviets had been reading our playbook for years. Reading the playbook. That's what it came down to. For 18 years, the Soviet Union knew what America was planning, what America was thinking, what America feared. They knew the strengths and the weaknesses, the capabilities and the gaps, and they used that knowledge to build submarines that could slip through American defenses undetected, submarines that could track American missile boats without being seen, submarines that changed the calculus of nuclear deterrence in ways that are still not fully understood. This is what one desperate man accomplished. This is what greed and opportunity can do when they intersect with access to secrets. In the end, John Walker's epitaph might be written in the sonar records of that October night in 1986, the sound of a ghost, a Soviet ghost wearing American acoustic clothing, gliding through the depths of the North Atlantic. That sound was his legacy. That sound was what he had sold. And that sound, quiet, deadly, impossible, is still echoing in the corridors of power, a reminder of how quickly everything can change when trust is betrayed. The Cold War ended, but the submarine challenge didn't disappear. It merely transformed. Today, the United States faces a new generation of quiet submarines operated by countries that benefited from the technology transfers of the 1980s. Chinese submarines patrol waters that American boats once dominated. Russian boats, though fewer in number, still pose a credible threat. and the techniques for acquiring secrets have only grown more sophisticated. Cyber espionage can steal in seconds what once took years of patient cultivation. Supply chains span the globe, creating countless opportunities for technology to fall into the wrong hands. The digital age has made every vulnerability a potential catastrophe. The lesson of the Walker case, the lesson of that impossible sound heard in the darkness of Suitland, Maryland, is that vigilance must be eternal. The price of security is not just money, but constant attention, constant skepticism, constant awareness that somewhere, someone may be calculating what your secrets are worth. Because somewhere out there in a car parked outside a bar, or in a corporate office overlooking a busy city, or in a quiet room where no one is watching, someone may be making the same terrible decision that John Walker made on that rainy November night in 1967. And the sound they create, the impossible, terrifying sound of betrayal, may be coming to a listening post near you. This story is based on historical records, court documents, congressional testimony, and the accounts of those who lived through these events. The dialogue has been dramatized for narrative effect, but the core facts, the scope of the Walker spy ring, the Toshiba Kongsberg scandal, the impact on American submarine technology, are matters of public record, documented in government reports and historical analyses. The individuals mentioned in this account made choices that had consequences reaching far beyond their own lives. Their stories serve as a reminder that history is not made only by presidents and generals, but by ordinary people facing extraordinary temptations. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the hidden battles that shape our world, please consider sharing it with others. And remember, the secrets of today become the history of tomorrow. The sound of that submarine is still out there, somewhere in the depths. Listen carefully, you might just hear it. But what they didn't realize in those dark early morning hours in Suitland was that this discovery was just the beginning of the unraveling, because parallel investigations were about to converge in ways that no one could have predicted. In the weeks that followed, intelligence analysts from across the government began comparing notes, and what emerged was a picture of compromise so total, so devastating, that some officials simply refused to believe it. The Navy's entire cryptographic infrastructure was suspect. Every communication sent over the past 18 years, every operational order, every deployment schedule, every war plan, had to be presumed compromised. It was like discovering that your house had been robbed, but the burglar had been living in your attic for 2 decades, listening to every conversation, reading every document. Admiral William Crowe, who would soon become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was briefed on the situation in the fall of 1986. According to those who were present, he listened in silence for nearly an hour, occasionally asking clarifying questions, his face betraying nothing. When the briefers finished, he sat for a long moment without speaking. Then he said quietly, "How do we know it's not still happening?" It was the question that haunted everyone. The Walker ring had been caught, yes, but were there others? How many more John Walkers might be out there, still feeding secrets to adversaries, still eroding the foundations of American security? The honest answer was, they didn't know. They couldn't know. The counterintelligence failures that had allowed Walker to operate for 18 years meant that other penetrations might still be active, still undetected. The assumption of security that had governed classified operations for decades was gone, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. This uncertainty drove a massive restructuring of American security protocols. The system that Walker had exploited, where a single individual could have access to virtually unlimited classified material, was fundamentally redesigned. New background check procedures were implemented. Compartmentalization became stricter. Monitoring of personnel with access to sensitive information was expanded. But these reforms came too late to undo the damage already done. The Soviets had their intelligence. Their submarines were already at sea, and the technology genie, once out of the bottle, could not be put back in. Consider the position of American submarine commanders during this period. These were men who had trained their entire careers to execute a specific mission: find and destroy Soviet submarines. They had confidence in their boats, in their sensors, in the silent advantage that American technology provided. They knew they were better than their adversaries. And now, suddenly, they weren't sure anymore. Commander James Bradley, who skippered a Los Angeles-class attack submarine during this period, later described the psychological impact. "We'd go out on patrol, and we didn't know what we'd find. We didn't know if they could hear us coming. We didn't know if our tactics still worked. Every contact was a question mark. It was like playing poker when you know the other guy has seen your cards, but you're not sure which ones." That uncertainty was perhaps the most corrosive effect of the Walker espionage. It wasn't just about what the Soviets knew. It was about what they might know, what they could know, what they had perhaps known all along. The confidence that had characterized American naval operations was replaced by doubt. The submarine service adapted, as it always does. New tactics were developed. New technologies were deployed. The silent war, as some called the undersea competition of the Cold War, continued with renewed intensity in its final years. But the Walker legacy persisted. It persisted in the upgraded Soviet submarines that American boats encountered on patrol. It persisted in the billions of dollars spent to restore acoustic advantage. And it persisted in the institutional memory of the intelligence community, a constant reminder of how bad things could get when counterintelligence failed. There is one more aspect of this story that deserves attention: the human cost. We've talked about the strategic implications, the technological transfers, the billions of dollars in damage. But behind those abstractions were real people whose lives were affected by Walker's betrayal. Start with the sailors who served aboard American submarines during the compromised years. These men went to sea believing they were protected by the best communication security in the world. They didn't know that every message sent from their boats might be read by the enemy. They didn't know that their operational orders had been compromised before they even received them. In the event of war, the nuclear war that everyone feared but no one wanted, these men would have been at a severe disadvantage. Their positions might have been known. Their attack plans might have been anticipated. Their chances of survival would have been significantly reduced by Walker's betrayal. Fortunately, that war never came. But consider what it meant to serve during those years, to trust in security systems that were fundamentally compromised, to not know that you were operating in a glass house where the enemy could see everything. Then there were the intelligence officers who had to conduct the damage assessment after Walker's arrest. These were men and women who dedicated their careers to protecting American security, only to discover that their efforts had been undermined from within. The psychological toll of realizing the scope of the failure was substantial. One analyst who worked on the damage assessment later described it as the worst professional experience of my life. He continued, "Every day we'd find something new that Walker had compromised. Another system, another program, another assumption that turned out to be wrong. After a while, you started to wonder what hadn't been compromised. The answer was, not much." And of course, there were Walker's own family members, caught up in a conspiracy they didn't fully understand. His son Michael, barely more than a teenager when he was recruited, would spend most of his 20s in federal prison. His daughter Laura, who was not involved in the espionage, had to live with the shame of her father's betrayal and the public exposure of her family's crimes. Barbara Walker, the ex-wife who ultimately turned John in, spent the rest of her life dealing with the consequences of her decision. She was both praised as a patriot and condemned as a vindictive ex-spouse. The FBI's initial skepticism of her report haunted her. She felt that if they had believed her sooner, years of additional damage might have been prevented. These human stories don't change the strategic calculus, but they remind us that espionage is not just about secrets and technology. It's about people making choices that ripple outward, affecting lives in ways they cannot predict or control. John Walker made his choice in 1967, driven by desperation and greed. That choice led, through a chain of consequences spanning decades and continents, to that moment in 1986 when an analyst heard a submarine that shouldn't exist. From one man's moral failure, a superpower lost its secret weapon. That is the scale of what happened here. That is what we should remember. The late October sun was setting over the Chesapeake Bay on the day John Walker was sentenced. Outside the federal courthouse in Baltimore, reporters gathered to hear the verdict. Inside, Walker stood before the judge, his expression neutral, showing neither remorse nor defiance. The sentence was life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Given the magnitude of his crimes, many thought it was lenient, but Walker had cooperated with investigators, revealing details of his operation that helped assess the damage. His cooperation, the judge said, was the only reason he wasn't facing execution. Walker nodded when the sentence was announced. As he was led away in handcuffs, he passed his daughter in the gallery. Their eyes met for a moment. Then he was gone, disappearing into the federal prison system where he would spend the rest of his days. But his shadow remained. It remained in the classified briefings where analysts discussed the ongoing impact of his betrayal. It remained in the redesigned security protocols that bore the unofficial name Walker Reforms. It remained in the quiet conversations among submariners who served during the compromised years, comparing notes about what might have been. And it remained in the deep water where submarines still hunt each other in silence, where the technology Walker helped transfer continues to shape the balance of power, where the echoes of his betrayal may never fully fade. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. But the undersea competition continues, transformed but not eliminated. New adversaries have emerged, operating submarines built with technologies that trace their lineage back to the illegal transfers of the 1980s. The lessons of the Walker case, about vigilance, about trust, about the devastating potential of insider threats, remain as relevant as ever. As you go about your life, secure in the assumption that your country's secrets are protected, remember John Walker. Remember that sometimes the greatest threats come not from outside, but from within. Remember that one person in the right position, with the right access, can cause damage beyond calculation. And the next time you hear about a new espionage case, a new security breach, a new revelation of secrets stolen and sold, remember that somewhere an analyst might be sitting in a darkened room, hearing a sound that shouldn't exist, realizing that everything has changed. That sound, the sound of American technology in enemy hands, is the true legacy of the Walker spy ring. It echoes still, a warning from history that we ignore at our peril. Listen carefully, you might hear it too.